Alright, so we're going to talk about the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and Georgia's first Constitution. Alright, basically, once the Revolutionary War was over, we had to enact some type of a government in order to unite us as a country. The very first thing that we created was the Articles of Confederation. Well, we've got to describe the impact of events that led to the ratification or the approval of the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. In order to do that, we've got to look at or analyze the strengths and weaknesses not only of Georgia's Constitution of 1777, but also the U.S. government's Constitution of the Articles of Confederation. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to explain how these things were weak in order to lead us to the U.S. Constitution. Okay? Then after that, we're going to talk about the actual Constitutional Convention where we wrote the U.S. Constitution and the men that played roles within writing that document. Alright, so the American colonists have won the Revolution, and now they have to create what? Well, they have to create a government. Basically, all a Constitution is a written form of government. So any type of governing body gets together and they write up a document, they write up a constitution, and this is literally laying out how their government's going to run, the laws, consequences, protecting people's rights, this and that. And basically a constitution can be written for anything. But in our case, we're talking about America's first written form of government. This first written form of government, like I said earlier, was called the Articles of Confederation. Now, in today's government, most of us know this, but just to be clear, today's government has 3 branches of government. This was not created by the Articles of Confederation. This is the newest form of government. Our 3 branches are the executive, legislative, and judicial. Now, the state of Georgia also used these same branches in order to keep things running smoothly, basically. Okay, so let's look at the government today. Basically, we have 3 branches in the United States government. We have the White House, which makes up the executive branch. We have the Supreme Court, which makes up the judicial branch, and the U.S. Capitol, which makes up the legislative branch. Now, who is involved in each one of those houses? The executive branch, you're going to have your president and your vice president. You should know this because we just elected a new president as well as the new vice president last night. And that's going to go to the White House. It's the executive branch. They're the ones that enforce the law or sign or veto laws. Then you're going to have the U.S. Capitol, or what we call Congress. This is the legislative branch. Congress is bicameral, and bicameral means 2 houses. The 2 houses in Congress are Senate and the House of Representatives. Then we have the U.S. Supreme Court, which makes up the top tier of the judicial branch. Basically, your judicial branch is all made up of all your courts. And of course, the highest of courts being the Supreme Court. Legislative makes the laws, executive enforces, judicial interprets, making sure they're constitutional or that they don't go against the Constitution and your rights. Okay, we have the executive branch. Obviously, these guys have changed. Okay, legislative branch, judicial. Now, our first Constitution, like I said, was called the Articles of Confederation. Basically, we got together when we wrote the Declaration of Independence, which declared our independence. And we said, look, if we're going to declare independence, we need to go ahead and set up a government in order to have something that's going to help run our new country if we were to win the American Revolution. And so we did. Our first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. And it was really bad. It was very, very, very bad. Basically, what it did is it set up a very weak national government. They did not want anything to resemble any type of a monarchy like a king that they had with England. And so they said, look, we're going to take away basically all the national government's power. And they did. Well, they gave all the power to the states. And at this point, there were 13 states. So each state had one representative or a couple of representatives, but they only had one vote for each state, and they went into a unicameral legislative branch. So basically, it's one branch, which was Congress. It was unicameral, so there was one house. There was no president. There were no court systems, and this legislative branch was basically the ones making all the decisions and the calls. Well, the national government, because they were so weak, couldn't collect taxes. Therefore, they couldn't provide services for our country. They could not afford to organize an army or basically carry out any government activities because we couldn't collect taxes, because taxes is what pays for all of this. It also set up the fact that each state had a different money system. Now this comes into play because you can't regulate trade between these states because their money systems don't go hand in hand. And basically it's just very hard to do that. Last but certainly not least, because of the Congress, or because each state only had one vote, it was very hard to pass laws because 9 out of those 13 states had to agree. And that's well over half of the states having to agree. And it's very hard to get 13 people who represent 13 completely different states to agree on anything. So very few laws were actually passed under the Articles of Confederation. Did they have some strengths? Sure, a couple. The biggest thing that it did was it did unite our state as one country. Okay, we became the United States of America under this. All states were equal. No one had more representation than the other. And so each state had one representative. And that was great because, hey, you know what? Congress could wage war. So we could basically write on a piece of paper, hey, we're going to war. But we couldn't back that up because we couldn't pay an army. We could control our postal services. So we made sure that people got their letters, but we couldn't regulate taxes, so we couldn't provide any type of protection for these people. And then, of course, Congress started to deal with the natives, deal with affairs with the natives. So that took that off the state governments. Okay. Now, basically, the Articles of Confederation were so weak, and England actually came right back into the United States and took over territory, and we couldn't do anything about it. So the representatives from several of these states got together and they were like, look, we've got to do something. This is really bad, and we're very weak. We can't do anything, and basically we look like a laughing stock. So what they did is they set up the Constitutional Convention, and they invited representatives from each of the states to come in and to figure out how are we going to revise or change the Articles of Confederation to actually be a decent document that would govern our country. So basically, they get there, all these states send representatives, and they realize very quickly that there's just no hope for the Articles of Confederation, and basically they wad them up and throw them out, and they start anew. And this is where we write the United States Constitution. Okay? It was written at the Constitutional Convention. It was held in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1787. This was not an easy task. It took a long while to come up with the U.S. Constitution. But two of the men that came in to represent Georgia were William Few and Abraham Baldwin. Abraham Baldwin is actually going to be very influential with this Constitution. So they get together and they start trying to figure out, well, how are we going to set up the Constitution and what's going to be included in it? If you'll notice, this is a painting of the Constitutional Convention. One thing that they actually did at the Constitutional Convention, which is not portrayed in this picture, is they actually boarded up the windows, they put guards at the doors, and they would not let anybody that was not a representative in or around the convention at this time. They wanted to keep it very silent, very secret, so they could write the Constitution and focus on what they had to do. They did elect George Washington as the president of the convention, which actually he ends up becoming our first president as well, because he is such a strong leader. The Constitution, they finally decided that it was going to set up the 3 branches of government like we have today: the executive, legislative, and judicial. They also said that the legislative branch would be bicameral. They're going to keep calling it Congress, but they're going to divide it into, we're going to divide Congress into the House of Representatives and the Senate. They approved a method of amending or making changes to the Constitution. These are what we call amendments. So instead of having to rewrite a Constitution every now and again because our societies are changing, they just make amendments to it. Okay. The first 10 amendments are so very important because these are the Bill of Rights. These are your rights as an individual. And this is what the country has to protect of yours. All right. And if you'll notice, you've heard probably all of these rights before. Some of the ones that have been the most important here lately: the First Amendment, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. The Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. The Second Amendment, of course, the right to bear arms. The Third Amendment was very important because it said that no soldier was allowed to be stationed in a homeowner's home without their consent, and that came straight from during the American Revolution when they, with the Quartering Act, which said that soldiers could stay in someone's home no matter what. So they took that and made sure that that could never happen again. The Fifth Amendment, making sure to you have the right to remain silent so you don't incriminate yourself or anybody else. And you can just go back and through and see all of these rights, and they play out on a daily basis. Now, Georgia obviously had to approve. They had to ratify this new Constitution, and there was actually a little concern about it. But finally, Georgia was very excited about this new Constitution for several reasons. One is the fact that Georgia supported this bicameral legislature, which was a two-house legislature. It was created by the Great Compromise, and I'm going to talk about that shortly. But basically, Baldwin helped us to get to this bicameral legislature. The second reason was because they hoped that having a new, stronger federal government would help them really fight the natives. And Georgia was wanting more land, and they wanted to get the natives out of the way. Third was because the Constitutional Convention, they agreed to accept the 3/5 compromise, which allowed for part of our slave population to be counted in Georgia, which is going to make more sense in just a minute. The Great Compromise. Basically, you have small states and large states, and they were trying to figure out how representation was going to be based. Small states said it needed to be a set number, and obviously that would help them out because they don't have as many people to count for population. Big states, on the other hand, said no, it should be based on population. We have all of these people, and we need to represent them correctly. Well, they went to a vote, small states and big states. They actually, Abraham Baldwin tied up the voting with a small states vote. Well, this ultimately led to the Great Compromise, which really helped us because we now have a bicameral legislature. Congress is split. The Senate, every state gets 2 senators, so there's 100 total. Every state has a certain number of representatives in the House of Representatives because that's based on population. The more population, the more representatives you have. Secondly, we have the right or the need to fight the natives. Georgia, many other areas were actually trying to move west, and we ultimately ended up taking over native land. And then the 3/5 compromise. Southern states said, look, we have all these slaves, they should count towards population. But the northern states said, but you don't even count your slaves as population in your state. You count them as basically farm equipment, so that they shouldn't count. End result, they finally said, well, look, 3 out of 5 slaves will count towards your population, and it made everybody happy. This was the first time that they could have truly dealt with the issue of slavery, and they didn't. So this is going to come back to haunt us later on. The Constitution also established 2 different rules. The first rule was called the separation of powers. Basically, it said, look, we've got these 3 branches, so what we're going to do is we're going to separate powers amongst these 3 branches. We're going to divide the powers up. One law or one branch makes the law, one enforces the law, one interprets the law. That way nobody's stepping on each other's toes. Secondly, you have checks and balances. Basically, it said, all right, we've divided up all these powers amongst the branches, now we're going to make sure that no one branch gains all the power by making sure that each branch can check over the other and then balance out its work. For example, if the legislative branch makes a bill, the president or the executive branch can veto it. If it gets vetoed and Congress really feels like, hey, that's a good law or a good bill, they can override it. So neither one of those branches have final say-so, because if for whatever reason this bill makes it into a law, then the judicial branch looks at it and they can actually kick out laws because they're unconstitutional or they go against your rights. The president also has the ability to check over the judicial branch because the president appoints Supreme Court justices. Well, he doesn't have the final say-so because Congress has to approve the judges. And then, of course, if a judge or the president is doing something wrong or they're not upholding their job title, then Congress or the legislative branch can impeach them or fire them for misconduct. Georgia has these same three branches. The executive branch, though, is made up of the governor and the lieutenant governor. Our legislative branch in Georgia is called the General Assembly. You can remember this by Georgia is abbreviated with a G and an A, General Assembly. Okay, and then our judicial branch again is our court systems, and our highest court system in Georgia is the Supreme Court. All right. Just like the U.S. Constitution, Georgia has a state constitution. Every state needed to have their own written form of government. The first constitution we wrote, which was in 1777, basically was it was written and made after the Articles of Confederation, so therefore it was very weak. Here's its weaknesses. Okay, basically you end up with the not the executive branch, the legislative branch having all the power. It was unicameral. They had no court system. They did elect a governor, though, but this governor didn't have very much power. He was chosen by the legislative branch, which was made up of 12 men. That was it. 12 men representing the whole state. And they said that the governor could only have a one-year term. Well, basically that just only gives the governor 1 year to try to do anything, and that doesn't give him room for anything. And then they would re-elect, or they would elect a new governor the following year. Were there some strengths? Sure. It did help us transition into a state. It started guaranteeing that we did have certain rights: freedom of religion, freedom of press, trial by jury. And it changed our 8 parishes into 8 counties. So it started us on the right track, but it just wasn't good. So we ended up going back in after we wrote the United States Constitution, and Georgia came together and wrote a new constitution, which was the Constitution of 1787. Again, that one is modeled after the U.S. Constitution, so it is a lot better than the first. All right. Yes, you will have a quiz over this, so you will use your notes to take the quiz, and then we will move on to our next standard.